Are you an opera fan but love a good fantasy league? Does the fight song of your favorite sports team move you almost as much as Nessun Dorma? Well, look no further than Opera Box Score. The OBS team brings you all the news that's fit to chat about the intersection of organized play and orchestrated slay. Now, I have to tell you, they had me on last week to talk about my life as a musician in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra and about the podcast. And these guys know everything about opera and sports, and they make it just as compelling as listening to a sports show. So I highly recommend you listen to that episode and check out their podcast, Opera Box Score, America's talk radio show about opera, period. Available wherever you get your pods. Prolific composer Nico Muhly has written music for the stage and screen, collaborated with pop icons, and has had 2 operas commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. His successful career was shaped in part by his practical approach to composition.
If you bother yourself about finding your voice, it does feel like this consuming energy that I think is not helpful. And it's like, write a bunch of pieces that don't work, see them occur, and have it be a fiasco.
You're listening to Speaking Soundly, the podcast that explores the art of artistry. I'm your host, David Krauss, principal trumpet of the Metropolitan Opera. As a musician in New York City, I get to perform with some of the world's greatest artists every night. During each episode, you'll hear me speak with these inspiring performers as we lift the veil on talent to hear about their process and the personal journey that led them to the stage. The first time I met you, you probably don't remember.
It was at Tanglewood?
It was at Tanglewood.
Yeah, okay, good.
So I was ready to talk about composery things like counterpoint, and I went in for handshake, and you grabbed my midsection right above my belt buckle, and you said, "I just love your cutlets," and walked away.
True.
That's so true.
That's probably true.
Yeah. Since then, I played 2 of your operas. I remember the first reading, and you're there with this kind of wide-eyed look. And in retrospect, it's a very vulnerable place for you to be in. Can you talk to me about what that experience was like?
Yeah, I mean, first rehearsals of anything are terrifying. And first rehearsals of opera, orchestra without singers, it's even more terrifying because it's the definition of decontextualized, right? Because there's a bunch of people looking at something for the first time who don't necessarily know the plot of what's going on, who are hearing something that's just a part of the whole thing. You know, normally in an orchestra rehearsal, it sounds like what it's going to sound like.
You're getting all of it.
Yeah, you're getting. So in this case, it's you know, the most you will get is very incomplete. Another thing that's really scary about the first rehearsal of anything is knowing what to say and trying to figure out what will get better without your saying something. So, you know, when people are sight reading, chances are, unless you think there's a misprint, you don't say, "Oh, that's a B flat, not a B." Do you say something? Do you not say something? Do you say something to the conductor? Like, it's just figuring out what your role actually is. Like, and then also you have the additional thing of this is not the space in which it will be heard. They'll be in a pit and there'll be singers and all this other stuff. So it's a negotiation. The last thing you want to do is be reviled by the orchestra. And it's very easy to do that.
And the experience of going from that very first rehearsal to not only opening night to then repeated performances of it, at what point in that cycle are you happy with the outcome?
That's a really good question. I mean, it depends on what the outcome is. I watch opening, that's it. And then the rest of them I watch from weird places. So I watch from stage management area or from the dressing room because I'm interested in how everyone who isn't me has a different relationship with the piece.
When you're composing, it's all in your head, it's all in the studio, it's all on your paper, you're the only audience, and then it's out there. Is that frightening? Is that exciting? Or are you completely benign to it?
It's all of those things. The beginning of your life as a composer, you're writing for your friends, right? And then suddenly you start writing for strangers. And then suddenly the pieces that you wrote for friends can be played by strangers. And that's just the method of transmission. The awareness of writing something for your friends when it's like you can talk about it, you're having a conversation about it. When you're working with an orchestra, the only thing that second flute player knows about you is the document that's on the stand. And that document is just the second flute part for this opera about which they know nothing. Now, your job as a composer, in a really, really like savage reduction of what it is to deliver a pile of paper. That's what it is. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that you could argue is the more important part of the job, but that's not actually what you're tasked with doing, right? what the commission is, we give you stack of money for stack of paper. That's, I mean, that sounds really mercenary, but like at a certain point you have to accept that. So the answer is, it is scary when it becomes other people's business, and knowing that, for instance, quite literally, there are people practicing a trombone piece I wrote in the Netherlands right now. And, they'll probably have a bunch of questions, which will come, via an email, via my publishers and whatever, there's a lot of.
But you're excited by that.
Yeah, that's cool. It's cool. It's also weird. There's another piece that's also being practiced right now, which is for soprano and lute. And the lutenist and
do people still play lute?
They really do. I've written a ton for lute.
I'm picturing one person that plays all the lute parts.
No, there's a million. I don't know. In America, it's a little bit different. You can't open a door in Northern Europe without a lutenist popping out. You crazy? No, it's insane. It's like you open any luggage rack in the Eurostar, there'll be like 5 theorbos in there. It's totally a thing. No, so the lutenist and I've been working together over Zoom and whatever, and it's not about me, it's about him, that they feel as comfortable as they can on stage playing this weird thing.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about your music. I feel like your music echoes what's in my head a lot of times. You wrote a piece called Mother Tongue.
Oh, yeah, Mother Tongue. Yep.
Yeah. The piece had this fluttering, angelic choir reciting and singing area codes and addresses. And I realized I'm walking around with this unending loop of stuff rolling around in my head. I'm curious, how did you see inside my head? And how are you so in touch with representing that through music?
I will say, okay, so what that piece is about is the idea of every person containing within them an archive of information and of emotional information and practical information, and that the overlap between those things can be really poignant. And the experiment of that piece is I brought in the singer, Abby Fisher, is one singer in this whole thing. I brought in the singer to the studio. I pressed a note on the keyboard and I said, tell me every phone number you know. And at that moment in time, I forgot what year that was, but I think it was when we were doing the overlap between knowing people's phone numbers and not. And
I don't know my daughter's phone number.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I barely know my boyfriend's phone number.
Right.
And we've been together for like 12 years. And when you actually think about how many phone numbers do you know, and then you think about what those phone numbers are, it's really interesting. It's like the number of the movie phone, like Barry, Vermont, but it's really random, right? And then the other things that she's saying are little mnemonic devices like, I before E, but not after C, like ways that you remember language, ways that you remember the order of the books of the Bible, like kind of anti-romantic personal archive. I can't stand the romantic view of composers where it's like you link one-to-one biography to notes and rhythms. If the most interesting thing we're saying about Beethoven is that he was deaf, or if we're saying like, okay, this bar is how you can see that like so-and-so is bad. And it's like, really? Let there be a sort of gossip column as distinct from a narrative of musical information. It's just, I feel like there's a laziness to thinking about music as a receptacle for explicit biographical information.
See, but I think that's funny because when I hear your music, I think about, that's Nico. Like that's his brain.
But that's brain, brain is fine, but it's not a narrative. It's less about what you think and what you know and more about the process by which you got there. I think that's a more interesting thing. And again, my music is really, really explicitly influenced by two things, right? There's 16th century, 17th century choral music, and then like American minimalism from the 70s and 80s. I'm not hiding that genealogy, but I'd like to think that the texture of the music comes more from the mental process of reconciling those two things than from the biographical information of those two things.
Okay, so a great example, the first opera that you did at the Met, Two Boys. There's a scene in a 90s era chat room.
Yep, remember those.
And the music is at once old and new at the same time because as they're singing, you have these outbursts of flutes and oboes that remind you that you're within the matrix. It's kind of electric cloud of music. So those two things really define a lot of your work. And that comes from simply your love of those two
things. In Two Boys, there's a couple things going on. I mean, the idea is that the boys, they first clock each other in church. So there's a explicit piece of Anglican choral music. The task of that opera is what does the internet sound like? Right. And so, of course, what the bad version is Tron, right? That suddenly you go into synthesizers.
Tron.
I love Tron. Tron is the best score ever. But like, what am I going to do in the Met Pit? Have like 8 synthesizers? So what I thought was, what's the version of a highly stylized harmonic environment plus the 16th century is what the internet is going to sound like? Because it's the two archival spaces that I find really poignant in my own life.
Do you feel the same kind of creativity when you're writing for a film versus writing a concert work?
No, it's different muscles in the sense that if you're an architect being asked to build something in the abstract, it's like you have a huge plot of land, go. Or, okay, it's on a hill, there's a rock that you can't move, there's a tree. It's like, all right, I have to start this cue in, Korea in 1894, and then it has to deliver us into Tokyo in 1987. And then go back to the 50s, and it's 3 minutes long, and there's a huge ship horn in the middle of it, and everyone's talking the whole time. But you think, okay, and it's not conscious, but writing an opera helps you do that. Writing a ballet helps you do that. It's just a different way of using your brain power. But film music happens so quickly compared to any other thing. It's a sprint. In opera, they commissioned Marnie the day before Two Boys opened.
Oh, wow.
Which was, number one, a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It was like, thank you for your trust.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But number two,
the day before, not after the New York Times review.
No, that's a great thing.
Yeah,
right?
that's great.
I'm sure the Times like, I hated it.
I can't remember. I'm sure they
I'm sure they hated it. It's fine. Listen, trying to please 3 gay men of different generations is, I know from experience, that's not something you can do. It is really funny. It's like they have 3 white gay guys and they're just like, okay, go see if you hated it.
It is.
Anyway, so, right. And that's 2013. I mean, it was a long ass time.
Right.
Film, it's like, okay, go. And you have like 6 weeks. And
in terms of accessibility with your works, especially those for TV and film, it's consumed a lot more. It's there. It's repeatable. Whereas if someone goes to a concert hall, hears a work once, and the only piece of information they have about it is the paragraph in the program that they're reading during the actual piece.
And looking up the names of the donors and the weird, like,
so
like Kimball Farms, like retired community program parents. Then you're like, my mama's not getting any younger, right?
So in terms of the digestion of your music, do you prefer repeated listenings? Does that matter?
I like the idea that whatever it is that you're doing is like immediately transmissible with some degree of fullness. You shouldn't have to hear it like 75 times to get it. There's a sweet spot, I think, in the same way that you meet a person and their first impressions, depending on how handy they are, parts of your body, apparently. The idea that whatever the first impression is indicates a depth of meaning rather than saying there's only depth of meaning and the first impression, you're not meant to get it. When people are describing like a house or whatever, and they say, oh, it has good bones. So that if you walked in there and were like a carpenter or something, you're like, oh, that's well done. As opposed to, okay, this is just like any other thing. I can't control whether or not people notice that. And I wouldn't want to like take them around the house and be like, look how I did that.
Instrumentalists practice technique, practice tone production, all the physical aspects of the instrument. Do composers practice, or do they just get older and develop and have experiences?
That's a good question. I mean, I think your practice is your practice. I mean, I use practice now in the kind of capital P sense of how people talk about like dentistry or yoga, where the act of doing it is an act of practicing it. There are a lot of composers who don't write that much music. For me personally, it's like I'm constantly writing something or thinking about something. There's constant stimulus and constant output and constant sense of one thing is practice for another, one thing is practice for another. Film feels like an exercise to help you write an opera better, and opera is an exercise to help you write a symphony better. And all these things feed into one another.
Mm-hmm. What was school like for you? Was there a point along the way that you found your voice or found your style? I'm assuming you're learning and borrowing styles. How do you do that without being overly derivative?
Right. Teaching composition is so abstract. The thing that to me was the most helpful was this triangle between seeing something on the page, hearing it, being able to write it down, So the triangle means that you can look at a score of Brahms or whatever without hearing it and know in your head what it will sound like. Then there would be hearing the Brahms and being able to write it down. And that's getting your ear ready for the process when you hear something in your own brain cage and need to write it down. Those are the things that are actually more like practice. If you bother yourself about finding your voice, or if you obsess over, I need to find my voice, I need to distinguish myself, it starts to feel a little bit like those lunatic kids who like prepare for the SATs too much.
Oh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it does feel like this consuming energy that I think is not particularly helpful. And it's like, you need to write a bunch of pieces that don't work, and you need to see them occur and have it be a fiasco. And those are the things that start helping.
What is a piece that doesn't work? What does that mean?
I don't know, something that's too long, which is everything.
Okay.
Something that, the balances are off, which is everything. But when you're a student, really getting it wrong is helpful. So school, it's like, I figured out pretty early, but I also was so busy in school because I was going to 2 of them and I had a job. And so it was like, I didn't have time to be like, where is my voice?
Right.
And it's like,
you say you don't worry about having a voice, but your music is unmistakably you. Was that a process?
You happen on it. I mean, in the same way you follow a bunch of recipes until you don't need to. And then it becomes the kind of way that you behave in the kitchen rather than a series of like dishes that you make. It's just like it's not improvisation, but it's a sense of like informed capriciousness.
Do you enjoy performing your own music as much as you do being in the audience when it is performed?
Way more. I need something to do. I think I'm sort of Labrador-like in that way. Sitting while it's happening to you can feel really strange sometimes. I like the idea that I have some responsibility. To a certain extent, and as I said with these operas, it's like I'll watch it one time and then it's, what am I going to do? Like, what am I doing? Of all the human beings in the world, I'm the one person who doesn't need to be there.
Right. So here's a weird question. When you compose, it's an idea, and then it becomes a very tangible, physical thing when the performer has to play it, whether it's on an instrument and there's keys, or a singer has to think about breath, and then it's played to an audience where it becomes, again, an intangible feeling. So that transformation from your head through somebody else's body back into a multitude of people's heads, this kind of transformation, does that amaze you?
Yeah, it's crazy. And I try to be hyper aware of like the fact of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, it was in my head and my hands, but it's in their body, because especially a singer who's moving around. With musicians, I try to be hyper aware of writing within the idiom, not to make it easy, but where it's like, you look at the page and you're like, okay, sports. I need to shed this for an hour a day. And then when I perform it, you to yourself will say, I just did this thing. But unidiomatic, crazy squirrel music, like R2-D2 xylophone things where it just doesn't matter. That's like a surefire way to have the worst thing happen at the orchestra rehearsal, which is that someone just thinks, what an ass. And that's when you lose it. They will literally call me up and be like, yo, your friend wrote this piece. I spent like 40 million years learning this one lick, and it's a completely arbitrary shape. And it's like, if one note had been different, it would have been fine.
So when you are composing, are you balancing simultaneously the creative impulse and the editorial commentary? Or is it creation and then you're like, okay, how am I actually going to make the math of this work?
It's simultaneous. Yeah. I have these charts that I make that, here, I'll show you. So each piece has this little like scheme.
And these are your sketches.
Yeah. But some of them are more like shapes.
So this is you just working things out.
Exactly. It doesn't have anything to do with notes, really.
These should be framed. I'm not looking at a music staff. I'm looking at shapes.
Exactly. Yeah. Like what happens in the piece. Like it goes from this to this. I keep the storyboard in front of me at all times. You map out the piece, and that can be really easy. And then once you have that, then you say, okay, let's figure out how the notes work, and let's figure out why the notes work, and let's figure out what to do with the bassoon.
But it's very organized, and this is your process for pretty much everything.
Yeah. But like, well, here, I'll show you. So there's this piece I love by Gibbons. So good, right? So there's all this like crunchy, So I said, what's the version where you just put the weird chord? So then here's this resonance. So that's this resonance. Right, so just all the notes between things that are sounding. So if you just listen to these chords, this is it. Right? It's each just chord, that's it. And then so all this little crisis. Absolutely diatonic. Just white notes. Just white notes. That's right, so it's like clearing the palette. Kind of Copeland-y, whatever. And then it comes out, right? So the whole time we've had that. And then it reveals itself, finally. So basically the whole piece has just been this one chaconne based on the chords from that if you just didn't play them.
Wow. With this kind of guided tour through your music, and I have a much deeper level of understanding even upon the first listening. But this is you, showing me literally the insides and outsides of it.
Yeah, it's not that complicated, but you shouldn't need to know this to like the piece.
Watching you explore your music and explain your music, it's very exciting. Is your own music therapeutic for you? Or is it cathartic? Is it necessary in terms of your everyday life?
Well, the practice of it is like just doing it is, I don't know how to do much else. Basically, the things that I like doing, it's like learning languages, cooking, and this. If your life is a list of like 7 simple pleasures, this is definitely one of them. Like having a space that I control in New York that I pay for with music. That's like one thing. There's, getting drunk on the lawn at Tanglewood listening to Firebird. That's also fun. Then there's making a great meal. There's like bumping into someone backstage in Cologne that you haven't seen in 5 years and having a schnitzel about it, or asparagus if it's that time.
Right.
I don't know. People derive pleasure from different sources, but for me, sitting and writing and thinking and whatever, and sometimes it's not about writing, it's just about like, oh, weird. I like this Gibbons. Let me just see what I can do with that. Let me see if there's a way that I can transform that.
There's a romantic notion of an artist, a painter, say, that paints for themselves and very reluctantly sells their work only to keep the lights on. Have you ever written a piece that you didn't want to let go of?
No, everything goes. But it's funny. Philip Glass, I worked for a million years, and he always gives me the same piece of advice. He's like, look, you're writing all these piano pieces, hold back a couple for yourself that only you play. Not a bad idea. It's I can't imagine a version of a thing that would be so private that only I would play it or hear it. No, the answer is no. I mean, the end of the thing that sucks is something that gets one performance. It's the worst.
Do you think that's a barometer of the piece itself, or just the circumstance of schedules and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Now I'm fancy enough, or whatever the word is, that I'll get a commission that's co-commissioned, and so at least it'll happen that number of times. The other thing is I used to take a lot of work that would be super weird. So it was like 9 male voices, string quartet, and piano. And then you do it and you realize like no one will ever do this.
Right.
However, sometimes you're surprised. I wrote a piece for 12 guitars and chorus, which has happened more than you'd think.
Wait, is that the piece that I texted you about just a couple weeks ago?
Listening to on the radio.com.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was listening to it and it was completely by chance. But the thing that I texted you, I couldn't figure out was, is that 2 guitars or like 12 guitars? And
12.
you go, it's 12.
You got it. You get in this sort of Price is Right way where you have to go over and under.
Exactly. Exactly.
The number of guitars.
So anyway, that piece
That piece has happened, 5 or 6 times, which is pretty cool. I'm writing this